Hi everybody, my name is Rebecca Newkirk and today we're going to be talking about dissociation. So we're going to be talking about first what it is, second how do you know that you might dissociate sometimes, so how would you be able to find that out, and what are some things that you can do to support yourself when you feel like you're dissociating. So you may be familiar with the idea that all of our feelings are serving a function. They're either trying to communicate something to us or they're trying to protect us from something. And I would argue that dissociating is no different. Dissociation is primarily to protect us, and usually we'll dissociate if we feel really overwhelmed or overstimulated, or whatever it is that's going on in the moment is just too much for us, and so we feel like we need to actually shut down or come up out of our bodies because being in our bodies in that moment is really just too painful. So people will notice that they dissociate if they have post-traumatic stress disorder, or honestly, sometimes even if they're just very depressed, or very anxious. So anytime being in your body or being in the experiencing in this moment just feels really overwhelming and it feels like way too much, that's when we'll dissociate. If you think about this in terms of protecting us from physical discomfort, think about the last time that you didn't eat for a really long period of time. It probably came in waves, right? You were really, really hungry, and then you didn't have any food around, or there was just not time to eat, and so you waited it out. And then you waited a while, it was really uncomfortable, but it went away, and then you forgot about it, and your body felt totally fine. Well, probably a couple hours later, maybe a little less than a couple hours later, depending on how hungry you were, that wave of hunger probably came back. Except when it came back with a vengeance. It was a little bit meaner and a little bit bigger and a little bit more uncomfortable and probably more painful. And you can keep doing that, right? You can actually move through that wave of hunger too, and it'll go away again because your body is telling you, hey, we need to do something about this, but then you don't do anything about it. So your body's kind of like, okay, well, she's not listening. There's no point in us continuing to send this message right now. So we're going to shut off. We're just going to shut that down for right now. And we'll come back and we'll tell her again later. Well, dissociating is like that, except for emotions. So if you feel very sad, very overwhelmed, very overstimulated, very, very anxious, or just uncomfortable or disgust, think assaults here, any type of like traumatic experience that you might have had, your body is going to decide probably in the moment, a lot of the time it does at least, there's nothing I can do about this, I can't fix it, and I can't make it go away, and I also can't survive if I stay here. I can't be in my body during this experience. It's way too uncomfortable or it's way too painful. And so I'm going to shut away the important parts of myself. I'm going to put them somewhere else so that they don't get damaged, and I'm just going to act like I'm not here. So I'm going to experience as though I'm not here. If you think about it, it's actually kind of ingenious. I mean, your body's pretty amazing at protecting you. Your brain is pretty amazing at protecting you. And it's doing that by shutting down and by shutting parts of yourself away. The problem is that when we have traumas like this, sometimes we become oversensitive, or we overgeneralize what's dangerous to us, or our stress threshold is just not very high. So things that maybe we would be able to manage or we would be able to work through, we maybe see a little bit of it and we kind of like pull back and we get really afraid from that, or we get really overwhelmed. And this happens in like a second. This happens really, really fast. And so our body and our brains just kind of decide that we're going to dissociate without asking our permission, and then we're gone. As a side note, I've talked to very, very many people who have beaten themselves up endlessly for not reacting well in the moment when they feel like something traumatic is happening. Kind of like someone is assaulting me or hurting me, and I just became compliant, and I didn't fight, I didn't scream, I didn't kick, I just kind of like went with it. And the reason for that is you're dissociating in the moment. So I think it's really important to say here, that is not your fault. It's not because you wanted it. It's not because it was okay. It's actually because your brain recognized that this was overload, and your brain decided, we're gonna get out of here. And the best way to get out of here alive is to shut off. and to be as compliant as humanly possible. And that's a form of dissociating as well. That is not your fault. Okay, so we already talked a little bit about what dissociating is in a broad sense, like what is its function, and why might we start to dissociate a little bit. Now let's talk a little bit more about what it feels like, or how you might know that you're dissociating. So there are two major types of dissociation that are pretty common, and those are derealization and depersonalization. And most of the people that I've talked to experience depersonalization a little bit more frequently, but I think they're both pretty common, and so we should talk about both of them. So let's talk a little bit about depersonalization. And a lot of the clients that I talk to who have experienced depersonalization will describe it as though they lose access to their thoughts and feelings. So they'll be around people that they're around pretty frequently, and those people will try to talk to them about something that maybe they're usually interested in, or they usually have thoughts and feelings about, and the client will just not have anything to say, and it feels like digging really deep to just come up with any small thing, because it feels like they're reaching into a void. There's just nothing there, and they can't find themselves. It feels like there's an absence of person, like there's almost like a shell walking through the day and doing their daily life. That's really uncomfortable, and it can impact our ability to feel intimate in our relationships. It can impact our ability to feel confident in social situations. It can impact our creativity, and it can make us feel like we're not good enough, so it can impact our self-esteem as well. Now let's talk about derealization. So the way that I usually describe derealization is all of a sudden everything kind of feels like it's happening in a storybook, or it feels like it's happening through a pane of glass, like nothing's quite touching you. Everything kind of feels like you're watching it instead of interacting with it. So when people talk to you, it might feel like you don't really need to respond, or you shouldn't respond, and then they're just kind of waiting for you to say something, but it feels like it's happening so far away that you're having a hard time. It's almost like responding through water or responding through molasses. It's really, really difficult to get yourself to engage fully, because it just feels like everything's a little bit surreal and a little bit weird and a little bit distanced from you. That is derealization. I think you might be able to see from the descriptions of depersonalization and derealization that they would have a lot of the same drawbacks, that they might have a lot of the same challenges for people, and that they're coming from the same place. So again, when we go back to that trauma model of something really bad is happening and it feels like it's too big, too overwhelming, too overstimulating, and I don't really know how to deal with this, I'm just going to shut off. I'm going to shut down. The equivalent would be, my body's going to stop giving my body signals that I'm hungry, because I can't do anything about that right now. I can't mess with this emotional state right now. It feels too big and too messy, so I'm just going to shut it out. Now, some people will actually do something that I'm going to call escapism. And when I'm talking about escapism, I'm really talking about dissociating through some type of media. So this could be TV shows, it could be movies, it could be books, it could be video games. But basically what I'm talking about is people who, for long lengths of time, will basically get lost in a story so that they don't have to be themselves in that moment. They've actually found a tool in their world to be able to dissociate through. And I want to be really clear, this is not always a problem. I think it's actually really important. I think it's a really cool thing that we can do. We can just kind of shut down, like, you know what, today was really awful, it was really hard, so I'm going to watch a movie and I'm just going to forget it ever happened. I'm going to try and pretend that I'm not me right now. And that's fine. I personally have used Harry Potter as escapism, quite a bit over the years, and that's why I've read it so many times, right? Because I feel like when I'm really overwhelmed or really depressed or really anxious or whatever, and I feel like I don't really have the wherewithal to deal with it in that moment, I'll go back into these books. They're really familiar to me, they're very comfortable to me, and so I can get lost in that without having to be myself and deal with my stuff. I think that's fine. The difference, though, is that sometimes we're choosing to do it actively. We're making a choice and saying, I am going to shut off after work today, right? In that example, versus there are some forms of escapism that kind of take over. So I've talked to people before who have just watched movies upon movies upon movies, and it actually got to the point where it didn't feel good to them anymore, because the movies or the Netflix or whatever was like taking over, and they were restless and they really wanted to move, and their body was like itching at it, and they just couldn't face being in their body in themselves, and so they felt like they had to continue watching the movies. I've talked to people who have had similar experiences with video games, right, where they'll just play compulsively and actually live more of their life inside of the video game than they do in their day-to-day, and this is the same thing. So this is problematic predominantly because it's not a choice. So escapism is fine, it's helpful, it's necessary sometimes, but it's only helpful if we can use it in moderation, if we can use it in small increments. So we've talked about what dissociation is, what it's for, why we do it, and we describe some dissociation so that you might have a better idea of identifying if you're dissociating or not, or if that's something that you have a tendency to do. I want to be pretty clear about this too. You're probably not going to be able to identify it in the middle of dissociating. So more likely, especially at the very beginning, you're going to notice that you were dissociated, that for a while you kind of left yourself. It might be a couple days later, it might be a week later, it might just be that evening. But if you take a couple moments to just kind of like run through your day, and I mean like maybe 5 to 10 seconds of just like recognizing, like, were there any moments where I was kind of not there? And if so, how long did they last and how did I know? That's going to really be your gauge. That's going to help you quite a bit in recognizing, is this something that I do or not? And is that something that I did today? And if so, what do I want to do about that? So if you find yourself dissociating, let's say that you've been practicing this for quite a while, let's say months, and you've gotten to the point where you can recognize it usually directly after, as you're kind of coming down, or maybe like right in the middle of dissociating. Maybe it's been lasting for a couple hours or a couple days, but eventually at some point you recognize, like, whoa, I'm dissociated right now. That's definitely happening. So the first thing that we want to be able to do is use mindfulness, but it's going to be really hard. So the whole point of mindfulness, and we talk about this more in other videos, and we'll talk about it more again because it's such a big deal. But the whole point of mindfulness is to actually come into your body, come into the moment, and experience whatever there is. Well, that's going to be a really hard thing to do if right now feels untenable, if this moment feels too big, too overwhelming, too overstimulating, and that's why you dissociated. So we want to add a step here before you start with the mindfulness. We want to add something that is going to make this moment slightly more pleasant for you. So I'm a little bit weird about using escapism to do this, but you can if you want to, if escapism tends not to be a problem for you. But finding something like a warm cup of coffee or a warm cup of tea to just kind of put your hands on and experience the aroma and experience the way that it feels having your hands on something warm, and notice your breathing, and take small sips and start noticing what that tastes like. That's a good example for me because I really like to drink warm drinks. I mean, that's something that feels like I'm taking care of myself, but it could be something totally different for you. It might be playing a song and really getting lost in the music. It might be taking a bath or lighting a candle and kind of watching the flame flicker or feeling the water on your body. What's important here is two things. Number one, we don't want to get lost in your thoughts. We don't want to get lost in your brain or like the rat race kind of stuff that's going on. That is going to either A, stress you out and upset you, or B, cause you to dissociate further. So what we want is to give your body something pleasant. We want to give you a pleasant sensory experience so that you can dive into that in a real way and utilize that as the core or the base of your mindfulness. So we talked about what dissociation is. We talked about 2 different types of dissociation that are very common and why we might do them. We talked about how to know if you are actually dissociating, and then we talked about what to do for yourself if it's available once you notice that you're dissociating. And again, I want to stress that the first step is actually to notice that you're dissociating as close to the moment of dissociation as possible. And then the next step is actually to give yourself a sensory experience that's really pleasant, that you can lose yourself in, that is not in your brain, not in your thoughts, but actually in your body. And then you can utilize mindfulness to delve into that sensory experience, and that can support you in coming back into the moment. So I hope this was really helpful for you. I think dissociation is fascinating. I'm happy to talk about it more if you have any additional questions. If you've had experiences with dissociation and you would describe it differently, please drop that in the comments. I think it's really helpful to have a bunch of different defining kind of factors or descriptors of dissociation, because it does feel different for everybody. And I hope this was helpful. Thank you again for watching. Please share this with somebody if you think it might be helpful for them, and I'll see you again in 2 weeks.